Chapter 14. Search for safety. "Move! Move! Move!" Jim shouted to Larry as bombs dropped all around them, destroying everything they knew and loved. Now, surfing on the beach wasn't even a thought as they ran, unsure of where to go. The one thing they knew was that they had to get away from the falling bombs, and moving farther into the city wasn't an option. The fight to keep fear from freezing them in cowardly masses in some buildings was pushed aside only by the sight of those buildings being destroyed. So they ran. "Jim, where are we going?" "Anywhere away from this. Now let's go," Jim replied without slowing down, as another block of houses one street over were turned into toothpick shards that he felt eat at his skin, carried by the shockwave that nearly took them both off their feet. The streets were filled with hundreds running for unknown safety, as Jim did his best to keep an eye on Larry. The two of them ran in a panic with the others, each just running away from the city as they tried not to focus on the mangled bodies that covered the ground around them. With every breath, smoke filled their lungs from the burning buildings and bodies as they tried to run faster than the devastation spread. Keeping an eye on the sky as aircrafts dropped their deadly loads, Jim could make out only a large red star painted on them before looking back down for a clear path in which to run. Through the chaos, Jim's eyes locked onto Mary standing alongside the road in shock. Jim had attended school with her since kindergarten and had had a crush on her for most of that time. Despite that, Jim wasn't even sure she knew his name. After all, Mary had become very popular at a young age, and although Jim and Larry were not at the bottom of the social ladder, they were still not high enough for Mary to notice. "Larry, follow me!" Jim yelled as he changed direction. His basic instinct for survival was overridden by his desire for Mary. "What the hell are you doing?" Larry couldn't believe Jim's attraction for Mary outweighed the need to stay alive. Before he could stop Jim, he was already calling out. "Mary!" Jim called out for her once more when he was only a few yards away. He saw her turn to him with a dazed look on her face. "Jim!" She spoke as if trying to be quiet so that others couldn't hear. Jim didn't know what Mary had said, but could tell by the movement of her lips that she had spoken his name. "Mary, what are you doing here? We have to run!" Jim grabbed her hand and tried to drag her along, but quickly realized that she wasn't going to move. He turned to her as he heard Larry shouting, "Leave her, man, let's go!" Jim wasn't ready to give up, even with the bombs falling all around them. Grabbing her by the shoulders, he began to shake her violently. "Mary, you have got to move." Looking slightly more aware, but with little emotion, she said, "They are all dead. Everyone. Mom, Dad, my sisters." As Jim looked over her shoulder, he could see nothing but a burning heap where her house once stood. She lived miles from him, and yet, without realizing it, he had run the distance in a very short period of time. "Our parents are too, and if we don't get moving, we will be also. Now let's go." With all his strength, he pushed on her shoulder in the direction he wanted her to run. This time, she slowly began to come out of her shocked state and moved, picking up more speed as reality returned. "Great! Can we pick it up?" Larry shouted with agitation in his voice. Within a block, all three were at full speed, once again dodging obstacles in their path, passing through neighborhoods that had been leveled to the ground along with the people who lived there. Jim redirected Mary's attention each time he felt or saw she was beginning to fall back into a state of shock. After a few miles, tired and thirsty, they began to notice the bombs were growing fewer, until they were falling only in the direction from which they had come. "Over there." When Jim turned to see what Larry was talking about, he saw him pointing to a water fountain by a baseball field in the park. Without a second thought, Larry began to run over with Jim and Mary close behind. They were not the only people who had spotted the fountain. As they neared, a group of people was trying to get to it, each fighting for the first drink. Jim stopped quickly, grabbing Mary's hand and pulling her back as the sound of gunfire erupted. Larry almost slid to the ground as he tried to stop and turn away, running back to his friends. Screaming filled the air as people ran from the fountain. The three leapt behind a concession stand for cover, where they watched a large man covered with tattoos walk up to the water fountain with a pistol in his hand. Jim whispered. "He shot those people." All three could see two people lying on the ground motionless, and a third holding his midsection as the man who shot him bent over to drink from the fountain. Not sure what was happening, Jim, Larry, and Mary watched as the man began kicking the fountain. "We need to go," Jim said, turning away from the dead and dying. Quietly, they began to move away from the building, putting some ground between the man destroying the water fountain and themselves. Off in the distance, they could still clearly hear the sound of bombs exploding and aircraft overhead. Once they had blended in with others, they again searched the area for something to drink. They walked past gas stations and grocery stores that had been stripped bare since the power outage. "We have to find water." Larry could feel the words hanging in his throat as he spoke. Just then, Jim spotted a dumpster and had an idea, one that he would have not dreamed of weeks ago. "This way," he told the others, though it was mostly directed to Larry. Jim noticed Mary had not turned loose of him since the ballpark, and to Jim, that was the highlight of his day. As they drew closer, Jim could smell the garbage before they even neared the dumpster. "What are we doing here, Jim? We should keep moving." Larry was desperate to put distance between him and the invasion going on back in the direction they had come. It only took a second for Larry to figure out what Jim was up to once he saw him open the dumpster's lid. Though he was repulsed by the thought, he hoped they would find something. "Jim, you're not going in there, are you?" Mary asked as she fought to keep from gagging from the smell. "Yes. We need water or we aren't going to make it much farther." Jim jumped over the side and into the dumpster. Minutes went by with no luck, not even a water bottle with a drop. "I don't get it. I see people throw away half-full water bottles all the time." "That's what I was trying to say before, Jim. They will not be in there. If you are looking for bottles, they are in the recycling bin." Jim looked over a few feet from the dumpster and saw where Mary was pointing. It was a large plastic container filled with bottles. Jumping out of the dumpster, the three went over to the bin. "I'm not drinking out of those," Mary said with a crinkled-up nose. "Listen, it is probably the only water around for miles. You won't make it without it." Jim could tell his attempt to convince her wasn't working, but figured there was no point in arguing. After digging through the bin, they had only 2 bottles of water after combining what they could find. Once Jim and Larry had taken a drink, they were down to 1, which was kept out of sight as they moved. It was clear to them that people would kill for a drink of water. "Where do we go now?" Larry asked, hoping Jim had an answer. "Away. We keep moving east until we cannot hear the bombs falling anymore. Then we keep going." Jim saw in Mary's eyes that her thoughts were still on the horrors she had seen that day. "Mary, are you coming with us?" Jim already knew the answer, but wanted to distract her from her thoughts, knowing just how dangerous it was to dwell on them. As many others had, he and Larry had also suffered great loss, making it hard to move on, not even having time to bury their loved ones. Just as Mary answered in the affirmative, helicopters flew overhead, firing on those running from their homes. Seconds later, at the end of the alley, they watched as cars passed by on the street, a very rare sight these days. "Move it! We need to catch them!" Jim shouted as he grabbed Mary's hand and pulled her along. "How are we going to catch them?" Mary was puzzled by the thought of stopping a car that had already passed while they were on foot. Not that one, but others that may be following. Coming to the end of the alley, all they saw were cars that sat where they lost all power, nothing more than a snapshot of where people were going in them the day the power went out. All around, people were still running, trying to find a safe place away from the fighting. Looking out from the end of the alley at the crowd of people, Larry began to speak, but was stopped by the sudden sound of weapons fire. Moving quickly back into the alley, they watched as people in the street were torn apart by the large caliber rounds. Mary buried her head into Jim's chest, covering her ears from people screaming in agony as the bullets stuck them with the sounds of balloons popping. The helicopters made several passes before moving on, leaving very few still able to move. Jim began to make his way into the street, filled with desire to help those who were still alive, but he stopped after taking a step. Jim's eyes focused on the street itself, which was covered in the blood from all who had been struck down, looking as if a red rain had just fallen. Jim struggled between wanting to help the injured and finding safety for himself, Larry, and Mary, knowing they had to keep moving, or otherwise they too would fill the rain gutters with their blood. Without saying a word, Jim held tight to Mary's hand and listened for the helicopters, then decided to move after hearing none close by. Once again they ran, moving around burning cars and the remains of so many people that they focused on distant objects as they tried to block out the sights around them. This was made difficult as their feet kicked arms and other body parts that had been severed from their owners. Blocks later, they saw the car that had passed by the alley, only now it was surrounded by the remains of people who had obviously attempted to take control of it, creating a prime target for the murderous helicopters. As they approached, Larry shouted with excitement, "It's still running!" He picked up his pace. Jim heard the engine running but noticed that it was pulsing up and down. It was still in gear and trying to move forward. The closer he got, he could see why it hadn't continued moving. Whoever was driving hadn't stopped for people in the road, and their bodies had piled up under the front tires, keeping it in place. At least that's what Jim assumed, as he couldn't bear to stare at the sight for very long. "We have to get in and move before the choppers return," Mary said, running to the driver's side door. Jim watched as she pulled a body from the door window where the person had died trying to get inside. The sight gave him hope that she was beginning to cope with her new surroundings. Jim began to help pull others from the car. As they dragged the remains of the tattooed man from the water fountain out of the driver's seat and onto the pavement, all three had the same thought. Serves him right. Wait! Jim could hear the helicopters getting louder and knew they were coming back around. "Lay down and play dead!" Quickly, Jim dropped on a few others who were already dead. "I'm not going to do that." Mary visibly cringed at the thought. "Then lay on me. If they see you standing here, then we are all dead, and the car will be destroyed. Now get down here." Jim reached up and pulled her down on top of him. In his mind, he couldn't help but think, not how I had pictured getting this close. Seconds later, the helicopter hovered overhead as Jim watched it through Mary's blowing blonde hair. "Don't move." Jim spoke to her, barely moving his lips. While they lay there on top of the dead with a helicopter above looking for something to kill, Jim wondered how Mary still smelled great after all the running and death they had gone through. Even though Jim was enjoying the closeness of Mary lying on top of him, the sight of the helicopter leaving was a good one. The smell of death around him was beginning to overtake the sweet smell of her hair. "It's gone." With those words, so was Mary. "Get in the car. Hurry!" As Jim rose, he spotted something he had never thought he would be grateful to see. A pistol. It was the pistol the tattooed man had used. He grabbed it as he jumped into the driver's seat and waited for the other two to get in before trying to move. Once everyone was inside, he put it in reverse to dislodge the bodies from under the front tires, and they sped off in what they had hoped would be a safe direction. "We made it!" Larry exclaimed joyously as they drove. Jim maneuvered around other cars sitting in the road, feeling heat radiating from Mary's skin as she sat between him and Larry in the full front seat of the late-model car that he could only assume was from the 1960s. "Oh, this is more like it," Jim thought, once again enjoying her being so close. They drove for miles without saying a word, enjoying not hearing the sounds of bombs exploding around them. Each looked at homes still standing, and people out in their yards looking around. Jim, Larry, and Mary all knew what they were doing, though they couldn't hear it over the engine. They were listening to the rumbling in the distance, the very thing they wanted to hear no more. As they exited the last of the neighborhoods, they saw nothing but open road ahead, a sight none of them believed would be more desirable than the city. "What is that?" Mary asked as she pointed at men standing along the road. It was a question that they didn't have an answer to as they neared. "Shit!" Jim shouted, turning the wheel sharply as bullet holes appeared to explode their way through the windshield, cutting his skin. Jim realized just what it was, slammed the brakes, and quickly spun the car around as the other two began to scream. Peach orchards lined both sides of the road, and to Jim, it looked better than the direction they were going, or the direction from which they had come. Hitting the accelerator, the car launched forward into the rows of trees. After a short distance, Jim once again turned the car to drive away from the city, hoping to move around the soldiers blocking the road. Turning was made difficult by the size of the car and the small spaces between the rows of peach trees, which had removed the mirrors and most of the door handles. Jim slowly began making his way back to the road, feeling as though he had covered enough ground. Preparing himself to turn the car hard left once they exited the trees back to the road, Jim watched the pavement grow closer. Mary and Larry looked all around them for signs of soldiers as they passed through the rows of trees, while at the same time bracing themselves with one hand on the dash and the other against the roof. "There it is, Jim! The road!" Larry shouted, his voice shaking from the bouncing car. Jim watched as the trees began to vanish and knew he had to start turning before the car reached the pavement. As soon as the last tree had passed, Jim turned the wheel hard, causing Mary and Larry to slide against the passenger door. Tires screeched as they made contact with the pavement, and Jim struggled to remain in control. His was much easier on Grand Theft Auto, he thought. Within seconds, he had the car stable and driving straight. Glancing into the rearview mirror, he could see the soldiers and realized he hadn't made it as far beyond their position as he had thought. As he watched them through the mirror, wetness splashed the side of his face, and the mirror no longer showed the soldiers, only his face dripping with blood and tissue. Mary laid her head on his shoulder, but Jim understood from Larry's screams that she wasn't trying to show him affection for getting her out of the city.